Now, just a few words about Gilbert King, who is actually a good personal friend, and he's been featured at 3 previous Writers Institute events. He likes to be called Gil. He grew up in Schenectady and Niskayuna and graduated from Niskayuna High School. And he reached the pinnacle of the literary world when he won the 2013 Pulitzer Prize in Nonfiction for his book, Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, The Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. The Pulitzer jury commended it as, quote, and this is what they wrote, a richly detailed chronicle of racial injustice in the Florida town of Groveland in 1949, involving 4 Black men falsely accused of rape and drawing a civil rights crusader, an eventual Supreme Court justice, into the legal battle. The citation left the name out of that crusading young lawyer. His name was Thurgood Marshall. It's a tremendous book. We also have copies of it for sale. I should mention Bookhouse is here tonight, and Gil King will be signing afterwards copies of that book and his other books. His earlier books include 2008, The Execution of Willie Francis, Race, Murder, and the Search for Justice in the American South, an account of the wrongful conviction and death sentence of a 17-year-old Black boy in Louisiana in 1946. He's also the author of the 2018 book, Beneath a Ruthless Sun, a true story of violence, race, and justice, lost and found, published in 2018. And now, in somewhat similar vein, chronicling murder and racial injustice, comes King's major work, Bone Valley, the story of Leo Schofield, who has spent the past 35 years behind bars in Florida and is sentenced to life in prison for the murder of his wife, Michelle Schofield, who was 18 years old at the time. King argues and presents compelling new evidence that Leo is an innocent man, and he presents exhaustive research that it was a wrongful conviction that needs to be overturned, and Leo Schofield deserves to be set free. But instead of telling this very sprawling and investigative and penetrating work as a nonfiction book, he's the writer, producer, and host of a 9-part acclaimed narrative podcast series titled Bone Valley. It's a departure for King and for the Writers Institute. We figured it was time to introduce the craft of podcasts into our lineup. So this is the first time in our 40 years of programming and almost 2,500 writers that we featured a podcast. So we're going to make history tonight. So you're all in on it. But we always look to broaden our perspective for our audiences, and we try to bring diversity in every way possible. So we're going to dip our toe into what's become an ocean of podcasting productions, which is really narrative storytelling in a different form between traditional ink on paper, between a binding. It's a genre that shows no signs of slowing down. Podcasts are coming fast and furious, but Bone Valley is not only coming from a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, it has already won attention in significant ways. Earlier this week, Bone Valley was nominated for 3 Ambies, which are somewhat akin to the Oscars of podcasting. Its 3 nominations led the pack in a very competitive field. It's nominated in the categories of Best Documentary Podcast, Best Podcast Host. Gil is up against Anderson Cooper, J.B. Smoot, Heather McGee, and others, and Best Reporting for Gil and his collaborator, Kelsey Decker. And he'll have a lot more to say about Kelsey Decker this evening. You may have also read the story in the New York Times last week about Judge Scott Cupp, a former defense lawyer who was responsible for convincing Gil to take on the case of Leo Schofield. We'll hear about that as well. And now Judge Cupp, at age 66, resigned his judgeship and is taking on full-time and unpaid the effort to overturn what he considers a terrible injustice and to set Leo Schofield free. Judge Cupp announced that he's resigning and he's taking this up full-time to exonerate and to free Leo. So Bone Valley, just for a bit of perspective, it's been downloaded more than 6 million times. It's reached number 4 on Apple's podcast chart. It's named to several best of the year lists. And it brought a lot of attention to Lava for Good, which produced the podcast and specializes in stories focused on social justice issues. So please welcome to the stage the pride of Schenectady and Niskayuna, back our friend at the Writers Institute, Gilbert King. So Gil, it's great. You had some family here and friends here. We've kept you working. We went to a creative nonfiction class with Professor Ed Schwarzschild earlier. Then we had a craft talk, and we had a dinner with some of our guests. And now you're here. How's it feel to be back in the 518 from Brooklyn?
It feels great to be back. Always great to be back up here, but it does feel strange that it's a podcast. You know, like I'm used to the book thing, and the podcast was news. I think we'll have a lot to talk about in terms of that, but it's slightly that the podcast. We're going to play a clip in a little bit.
Yes,
which is no one's ever played a clip when I did a book talk.
So yeah, we're going to play the trailer in a little bit for those of you
Yeah.
who don't know the story, but it's really a story about this innocent man. You were actually in Florida talking about Devil in the Grove. You had another book project in mind, and somebody hands you a business card. Tell us how this all started. It's an amazing twist of fate.
Yeah.
How to set you on this journey.
Yeah, I was down doing a judicial conference in Naples, Florida, and I was just there to talk about my book for 300 Florida judges, circuit judges. It's practically every circuit judge in Florida is there. And at the very end of my talk, one of the judges came up to me when I was signing books, and he handed me a business card, his business card. And I turned it over, and on the back it said Leo Schofield, had his prison number, and then in quotes it said, "Not just wrongfully convicted, he's an innocent man." And I remember looking at like, judge just gave me this? That's kind of weird. And he kind of signaled to call him sometime. And I didn't know what to do with it. I've never gotten a tip from a judge before for a story, so it was kind of weird. And I went out to dinner that night with some public defenders. And I said, "What do you make of this? This judge just handed me this card." And they looked at it and like their faces were shocked. They were like, "A judge gave you this? He's a sitting judge? They're not supposed to do this. There's all these judicial codes about conduct and not supposed to do that." And they kind of passed it around the table among the defense attorneys. And the last one was from Polk County, where the story takes place. And I remember he looked at the card and he looked at me and he said, "I know this case. You should call him." And that kind of tipped me off that there was something behind this, the way he looked at me. And so when I got back to Brooklyn, I gave him a call and he started walking me through this whole story. And he said, "This kid was railroaded by the prosecutor. I can tell you exactly how they did it, and I'm ready to talk about it." And I said, "What about the judicial code of conduct?" And then he let some F-bombs flow and basically said, "Let him come after me. I don't care. Like this, I have to do this."
But it's remarkable because you get a lot of story ideas. Any reporter, like we've got reporters here, I'm a reporter. Everyone's got a story. You almost said no to this, right? Initially, like, I'm busy, I'm doing another book. You didn't want to do another Florida story, right?
Yeah.
What convinced you? Was it the transcripts that you started reading? Or?
Yeah. And that was one of the things I told him. I said, "Look, I got a couple projects lined up, but the most important thing is I have this next book, and I got a fellowship at the New York Public Library that lasted 9 months. And like, that's going to be my life. I'm going to be working on this." And I could just like feel his disappointment, like over the phone, like, how I can't wait years for this. Like, this guy is innocent and he's in prison. And the last thing he said to me, he said, "Just do me a favor, just read the trial transcript." And I think partially to get him off the phone, I said, "All right, I'll read the trial transcript." I didn't realize it was 2,300 pages, but he sent it to me and I started reading it. And, sure enough, I wanted to stay true to my word. I promised him I'd do it. I started reading and I got hooked, and I could see all the little things in the trial that just went off the rails with an overly aggressive prosecutor and a really lousy defense attorney. And I could just see by the time I got through the end of it, I was like, this guy definitely didn't do it, because they did not prove their case. So
let's talk about Kelsey Decker, who's phenomenal throughout this, and you give her a lot of credit. She worked tirelessly alongside of you, but also you weren't thinking podcast, right? This was going to be another nonfiction book. She was working with you on the previous project. Talk about how it moved from an idea for another book into podcast terrain.
Yeah, it is interesting because I said, all right, maybe what I'll do is, as a compromise, I'll write like a feature story, because I was working with the Marshall Project, which is a criminal justice nonprofit. And I told him I could do a feature story about his case, maybe just make that clear. And I thought maybe it'd be like 6 months that I would just get, distracted and work on this case, write a story. And one of the things is we decided, Kelsey and I decided, she was working as my researcher on my book. And we decided to go down to Florida and interview Leo Schofield in prison. And that was sort of the thing. We went in there with just like a little tape recorder that I taped for like my interviews for books. I wasn't thinking about sound or anything. I was just thinking of getting the words down. And we came out of there just thinking, this guy's an incredible storyteller. Some of the things he was telling us just kind of blew us away, like the poetic way he would speak about justice and his case and his life. And I remember thinking like, I don't know what I'm going to do about it. Like, it's like I write this, and Kelsey's like, well, why don't we do a podcast? We could do a podcast because all the people that are involved in this case are still alive, which is kind of unusual for me because I'm usually dealing with like civil rights cases in the 1940s where everyone's dead. I'm just looking at documents the whole time. And now we have Leo can tell his story, and we've gotten permission from all the other people who were involved. And it just seemed like, let's just try this. These voices are so powerful. And so that's what we did. We pivoted to a podcast without knowing what we were getting into, how long it would last. And we'd end up spending the next 3.5 years working on this one story. And everything else I was working on just had to be put to the side to take on Leo's case.
But as a writer, you're used to just pouring over draft after draft, elegant prose, for your books, 100,000 words, 120,000 words. This is very spare. And at the center is the recorded sound. It was the voices of Leo and the people involved in the case. How did you come to write in that form as opposed to just you and the blank page? Here you're kind of writing introductions or transitions, right? Talk about that.
Yeah, it's really challenging because, first I had to learn that I was a terrible interviewer. I always thought I was a good interviewer. Like this is hard to imagine, but I've had 4 people confess to me over my career to murders they committed that were not solved. And so like people sit down, for some reason they tell me shit. I don't know why, but it happens on planes. It happens in taxi cabs. It's kind of a blessing or a curse. But in this particular case, yeah, it took a lot to get used to, because usually when you're interviewing for a book, you're talking a lot. So they'll tell you a story and like, yeah, is that right? You say stuff like that, and it disrupts the tape. And, we'd get it back there and like producers would go, this is awful. You won't shut up. You just keep saying yes and tell me more, or wow. And like had to learn to shut up. And what I realized is as you're talking to people, when you start to learn how to do it properly, you just kind of nod a lot, and the silence makes them talk more. And sometimes you get the best stuff when they're out of air and they don't like the dead time and they just say something else. And that's like the best part of the podcast. So I had to learn to do the interviewing. And once I learned to interview it right, then the interviews just got stronger and the audio got stronger. And there was less of a need for me to talk and more of a need for the subjects to tell their stories. And so it became a different collaborative effort that I wasn't used to. But I think it made me a better storyteller in a lot of ways. I'm really curious about going back to book publishing and writing books, because I think I learned a lot from trying to do this structure of writing around really good sound and really good interviews. And it's just a different collaborative form of storytelling. But to me, it's the same thing. It's still storytelling. It's still an area that I'm really interested. Criminal justice and injustice and wrongful convictions. I really like jumping around to these different ways of telling stories, whether it'll be documentary film or television or books or long form articles. To me, it's all a different form of storytelling. But once you learn it, it's not that different, as long as you know you have the right story.
And how about being the host? You've never been done your own audio books. You had to learn how to be a dramatic reader, but you're not showy. It's your voice. You're very straightforward. How did that come about? Was it a lot of takes? Was it just reading it straight through? How were you doing the hosting, the recording part?
It's all based on insecurity. Like I don't know if you've ever listened to your voice on a phone or something like that. It's awful. And I remember, I remember saying, look, if you want to get a real host or a real narrator do this, I'm totally fine with that, because I think my voice is terrible. It's grovelly, whatever. I don't like it. And they're like, oh no, you have to do this. This is yours. You have to be the narrator. And I'm like, all right, I guess if you say so. And reading it was like, you end up I write long run-on sentences. I feel bad for the real professional people who have to read my books for audiobooks, because I write sentences like a paragraph long. And I'm like, I will never do that to another audio guy again after having to do it myself. Like shorter sentences, sparser language. It's not dumbing it down any. It's just making it simpler and easier to comprehend. And I think that's what I like about this podcast. I've had a lot of people say, like, you're not talking down to the audience. You're moving them through a very complicated and complex story, but you're not talking down, and it's not that hard to follow. And I think that's because of the writing. The structure that we did it's much less conversational and less procedural and more about an authoritative narrator guiding you through this story. It's kind of a hybrid, I think, between an audiobook and a podcast, I think.
So I know the previous students, a lot of the classes have listened to it. I'm sure a lot of people haven't. We do have the trailer, about 3 minutes. Should we listen to that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jen. And then we'll have time for questions in a little bit. So think of what you want to ask, Gil. Does this need any setup? This is the trailer to sort of introduce.
I don't think so. We designed this trailer to just get people's interest in the story. So I think it's self-explanatory.
Hey, listen, this is the story. It is what it is. You believe it or don't believe it. It's up to you. It will not change the fact that I'm an innocent man. Do you hear my madness?
In February 1987, Leo Schofield's 18-year-old wife, Michelle, went missing.
Laughter hides my fears.
I need to talk to somebody about finding my wife. I'm really worried about her. I'd like to find out something.
3 days later, Michelle was found stabbed to death off a freeway in Lakeland, Florida.
Shouldn't it be your responsibility to investigate?
Now, wait a minute. We have investigated this thing upside down.
No physical evidence connected Leo Schofield to the crime.
And he said, I'm going to put you in the electric chair. And I said, that's what you're going to have to do. But I'm not going to say something that's not true.
At 22 years old, Leo was convicted for his wife's murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Leo Schofield is a cold-blooded murderer. And if I have my way, he'll never get out of prison.
But after Leo's conviction, there were still so many unanswered questions.
Always, the fingerprints was a big question in my mind. Obviously, somebody was in the car. Somebody knew something. Who was it? What do they know?
So I took the fingerprint and I'm like, all right, who does it come back to? And he said, a guy named Jeremy Scott.
Jeremy Scott. Who the fuck's Jeremy Scott?
Grandma, has anybody come talk to you?
About what?
Murder?
Murder.
Murder.
Despite new evidence pointing to Jeremy Scott, Leo Schofield is still in prison. He's been locked up for the last 34 years.
You or somebody like you is Leo's last shot. I would just really like to know who did it.
I want you guys to find the truth. You know what I mean? I can leave this world knowing that at least it was solved.
I'm Gilbert King, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and I've spent the last 4 years investigating this case with researcher Kelsey Decker. Together, we set out to uncover the truth behind the conviction of Leo Schofield. But we would soon learn that Michelle Schofield's murder was just the tip of the iceberg, as our investigation pulled us down into the much darker world of Jeremy Scott.
Don't judge me till you hear the whole story.
Sorrow's depths are endless in this valley of tears.
From Lava for Good podcasts, this is Bone Valley.
Well,
So the singing is Leo. He's a kid from Massachusetts who's in a band, plays guitar, and he's still able to make some music in prison, I guess. So explain those voices. Those were all the key characters.
yeah, those are all the key characters in the pie. Well, there's a lot more, but those are the big ones, really. You've got the overzealous prosecutor convinced that Leo Schofield's responsible for this murder. And one of the things that we did and that we led up to is we eventually spoke to Jeremy Scott, and that's in the final episode. We explored Jeremy's whole life. We talked to his family members, his friends, and we soon learned that, he had confessed to some of his friends about some of the things he did in his past. So I think this is kind of one of the weird things that happened in this podcast, totally unexpected. we actually solved another cold case murder in the process of this. Jeremy just came out and confessed to killing this cab driver that we sort of thought he might have done it, but I didn't want to really approach him with it because I didn't want to spook him and scare him away. And so while we were interviewing him in prison, he actually just blurted it out. Basically like, I might as well tell you, I got away with killing this cab driver when I was 17. And, that's part of the story too. Like we actually took that confession and the letters that he'd written me and all the evidence that we collected, and we went to the sheriff's office and the state attorney's office, and they basically just blew us off. I still can't believe that. We're still dealing with that right now, but I gave them a confession, evidence that tied him to the murder, family members who said it, and the state of Florida is just blowing it off because they do not want to reinvestigate these stories. And so that became a big part of the story, like Jeremy Scott's story. In a lot of ways, it's almost two podcasts in one. It's Leo's story and Jeremy's story, and ultimately they converge at the end. I won't spoil it if you haven't listened to it, but it comes together in a very unexpected way.
And the prosecution's case puts Leo in the trailer, killing his wife. They don't find a trace of blood. It's a small trailer. You've got a neighbor who's the only real quote unquote witness who's very suspect. Tell us about their basic, what they convicted him on, and it didn't hold up for a minute. Like you said, you read the trial transcripts, but give them a little flavor of how flimsy the evidence to send him away for life.
Yeah, it was a totally circumstantial case, which doesn't mean that it's not a good case. But in this case, they had no evidence, no witnesses tying Leo to any crime. They had a woman who lived across the street from Leo, who was like the busybody in the neighborhood. And she claimed that she saw Leo carry out something heavy that looked like it maybe was a body and put it in the back of his car on the night Michelle disappeared. But when you look into it, like the police interviewed all the neighbors, none of them heard or saw anything like what Alice said. And then we eventually talked to the sister-in-law who lived right next door to Alice. And she said this in court too. She said, yeah, we did. We saw Leo carry out something heavy, but we didn't know what it was. We were joking around about it, saying like, maybe it's a body. But she said, this was a week or two before Michelle disappeared. It wasn't on the night that Michelle disappeared. And like, it was clear that Alice, the neighbor, had just made this story sound like it happened on the night that Michelle disappeared. And so that was the only evidence they had in this entire case. And that testimony made the trailer the scene of the crime. Well, police went in there for 9 hours and didn't find one drop of blood after a woman was supposedly stabbed 26 times in that trailer. There's just no possible way that would happen. We talked to so many crime scene experts, and they said there's no possible way he could detect or hide all of that blood evidence. It's just impossible, especially with the shag carpets that were there. And the state tried to say, well, maybe he cleaned the carpets. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement came in and said those carpets were still filthy. They were never cleaned. So there should have been blood all over the place, and there wasn't.
But the interviews you get were incredible. How many times did you have to work to get to some of these people to talk who had never opened up publicly, certainly not with a reporter, a journalist, a book writer, a podcast producer, and you get them, I'm sure it was hours and hours to get the clips you use and things, but how hard was that to get them? Did it help that this murder had been 35 years ago, or it didn't matter? Some people would still not talk to you, or?
Yeah, there was a lot of people that just didn't want to talk. I think the difficult part was all of these people knew Jeremy Scott when he was a teenager, like 16 or 17. And so we went back into the community where he was and tried to track down his friends. And we found out like half of the people that he knew and hung around with had been murdered themselves or ended up in prison. I mean, this was the community that we were going into. And it was just really difficult to find people that were willing to talk. Many of them were homeless. They were living on the streets with Jeremy. So it was a really difficult investigation, but we ended up finding a couple, and they were really, really valuable because they really pieced it together. Episode 5 is all about Jeremy's world. And we tracked down, we talked to his brother who was locked up in a prison in Alabama. And he started to tell us that he started remembering that he remembered Jeremy said something about, robbing a cab driver and he had to leave town, something about a gun. So he acknowledged it. And we met a lot of people who were formerly homeless, who are now like back on their feet and working, and they were willing to talk about it. But it was very painful. We ran into a lot of, well, I don't say a lot, several young women who were sexually assaulted by Jeremy, and they were willing to talk to us because they felt like it was an important part of the story. But, trying to ask people, putting a microphone in their face and trying to ask them to talk about the worst moment in their life is not something, you should take lightly. And so you have to build up those relationships over time and, just give them the outs and say, you don't have to talk about this. You don't have to be specific. You just talk about what you're comfortable with. But most of them found like it was sort of some form of like therapeutic value to talk about. They told us afterwards they're glad they did it. But it was a painful ask of a lot of people in Jeremy's world, because it was so mixed up in childhood abuse, drugs, imprisonment, murder. It was just a very a challenging place to try to get a story out of.
There were also these moments, you call them red herrings. I think they're like the swerve in the story, like you want to get me distracted and think it's someone. So there are a couple that stood out to me. Number one, Leo had moments of violence. He was physically violent against his wife.
Right.
He smashed a guitar, which you don't hide. You put it in there because you found it or you felt it served the story to, you could have kept that out. Why did you want that in the story? There's moments where I think like he's capable of violence. He's done violence. You talk about his violent acts.
Yeah. And that's part of the story. Like sometimes you want to look at these either black or white. Well, it's a gray area. This is not the fuzzy bunny of wrongful convictions. I've heard it said before. He's not the altar boy who just all of this evidence dropped out of the sky and now he's in prison. Like he did have a rough relationship with his wife. She was 17, turned 18. He was 21. He's a hard rock kind of guy. He was totally immature. He'd gotten physical with her, gotten in fights. But a lot of the evidence that they used against him, testimony, we didn't feel it was accurate after we did our thing. So there was definitely some people who were embellishing their testimony. And I don't know if you've listened to Serial, which is a really popular podcast that came out about 8 years ago and sort of a groundbreaking podcast. But there's a moment where, they talk to Don, who I don't know if you remember, but he's the new boyfriend for Hey Min. And they wanted him to go in and tell a story. And his story was like, well, Adnan seemed like a nice guy. We talked for a while. And the prosecutor, after his testimony, the prosecutor started yelling at him. You're not making him look creepy enough. You need to tell the story. And he's like, I told you the truth. And the prosecutor was like pushing him to give the kind of testimony that would lead to a conviction. And that's the kind of thing that happens in these cases with police. We found a lot of people would tell us that, look, I didn't really see anything, or I didn't really know much, but now he's in prison and they're telling us we got the right guy. Police are telling them we got the right guy. Tell us what you know about him so he doesn't get out and hurt somebody else. And that kind of pressure from police and from prosecutors is really significant, and it weighs on you. And you hear this all the time in wrongful convictions. Good, honest people end up sort of embellishing stories because they're being pushed by police and by prosecutors.
And then the weird part that you can talk about Leo's father, who's a strange person, and he ends up finding Michelle's body, which also then I thought, oh, maybe he's the killer. And I guess you wanted me to sort of look over there or not. Why was that a big part of it?
That's one of those things that the state used a lot against Leo. They said, his father found the body, and they told this tale along with the media. The media was complicit in this. And if you look in a lot of small towns, sometimes you see the media, their sources are the prosecutors and the police, and they kind of give that side in the press. I see it all the time. They're not talking to the defense attorneys. They don't believe the defense attorneys. They believe everyone's guilty. But it was a methodical search. They found Leo's wife's car on the side of a highway, abandoned. And so once they had the car, they just traced it backwards, and they all searched up and down Interstate 4, and then going all the way back to the restaurant where Michelle was last seen. And they split up. It was like a dozen family members. And Leo's father actually found Michelle's body in a drainage canal. But what he said after he found the body, he said, God led me to her, which I talked about earlier, is like akin to saying, God helped me find my car keys. He didn't say this before. The state tried to make it sound like he woke up in the middle of the night, said he knew where the body was and led police right there. That never happened. He only said this after he found the body. And he said some weird things about Michelle floating face up, smiling as if saying, thank you for finding me. And I think he said these kind of things to make people feel like, oh, or at least she may have died in peace. And he didn't help his son at all. This got used against Leo in a bad way. It made up the bulk of the state's case. This premonition, which just poisoned, it poisoned the whole jury. I think they just believed that this had happened the way they described it.
And he had the two fatal strikes against him. He had a defense attorney who did no preparation, could usually walk into that court just kind of with his rhetoric, just kind of carry the day. And then he up against this Barracuda prosecutor who was dirty, who didn't mind sending innocent people away, which he was on a fast track. So talk about those two characters and how a perfect storm against Leo's case, really.
The exact phrase, the perfect storm. I mean, he had an attorney, a defense attorney. If Leo had stuck with his public defenders, I guarantee you he would have been acquitted, because the public defenders in Polk County were experienced defenders. They knew the court system. They worked with Leo early on in the case to do the bail hearing. Leo got the lowest bail for anyone who was charged with first-degree murder of anyone in the state of Florida. It's because the judge looked at the prosecution and said, you don't really have much of a case here. And so it looked, if he was stuck with those public defenders, he would have been fine. But he ended up going with this kind of Better Call Saul attorney who was, a little flashy. His famous thing was trial by ambush. I do no preparation. I just think quick on my feet, and I'll just take the state's case and cross-examine them and blow holes in the theory. And he told Leo he had a 90% chance of walking. And the prosecutor, John Aguero, just ran over him like a truck. He was completely unprepared. He never looked at any of the police reports. He missed some really important alibi evidence that I know those public defenders wouldn't have missed, that put Leo in certain places that he couldn't have been doing what the state was doing. And even with that, it basically came down to Leo was out looking for his wife, and he was basically talking to police at the same time that Alice Scott said she saw him carrying something heavy out of the house. He would have had to have been in two places at once, but it just didn't matter because Leo's lawyer was so bad. He just couldn't fight that. He just didn't have any discipline or any attention to detail, and tried to do it all on personality, and it didn't work.
So Jen has a microphone. If you raise your hand, I'll ask one more question while you're thinking of a question you want to ask Gil. This is going on. You are deeply involved in a petition drive. He's got a hearing coming up, a parole hearing. Talk about what's next for Leo and what's the possibility of actually, and then tell your Ron DeSantos story in Devil in the Grove, which is interesting because the politics in Florida, it's going to be very difficult to get him out, but DeSantis did what he said earlier. You can tell that story.
So Leo got sentenced to 25 years to life. And at 25 years, having served 25 years, he becomes eligible for parole. Leo is a model inmate. He's got multiple college degrees. He's started programs like the AIDS awareness program in the prison. He's the minister of God behind bars in the prison. He hasn't had a single disciplinary infraction in, I think, 20 years. And he's only had 5 in his whole imprisoned life. And they're all for minor stuff like getting hurt one day and not being able to work, little things, nothing. He's been a model inmate and somebody who served his minimum 25 years ago, 10 years ago. So he's about to have his 4th parole hearing. In the last 3 parole hearings, the investigative social worker has recommended parole for Leo. And when it comes to the parole hearing, the state attorney's office sends somebody, and they basically, it's like a dog and pony show. They show up with the autopsy photographs of Michelle, pictures where her body is covered with these stab wounds. And they say, Leo Schofield has never apologized. He's never taken responsibility for the murder he committed. He's not ready to go back into society. And they do this every time. And when the commission hears that, they vote to keep Leo in prison. And so we went through that once in the podcast. I thought that was Kelsey, her greatest moment, where we couldn't get the state attorney's office to talk to us. They wanted nothing to do with us. And so I said to Kelsey, look, I can't make it down for the parole hearing because I have something in New York that I can't get away from. You're going to have to do this on your own. And so, here you have this nervous, like 23-year-old young woman who's now going to interview this very powerful state attorney, and like sort of one of those ambush interviews outside in the hallway. And I remember she texted me and she said, I interviewed him. And I said, send me the tape. I was dying to hear it. What I love about this thing is like Kelsey's a very nervous, she's never done anything like this. And her arc, as she just started out as this nervous researcher to the end where she's basically solving these cases and being a real hard ass in these interviews, she interviews this really tough, powerful, like Bull Connor type state attorney. And Kelsey's always been the keeper of the facts. She knows the case better than I do. And, she started out asking this very innocuous question, and then Jerry Hill, the prosecutor, just started getting all the facts wrong. And she was right on top of him, and she's correcting him. And I knew it from my personal experience. I kind of said, oh, he's dead, because I know the case, and she wouldn't let me get away with anything. So she's interviewing this guy. She says, what did you think when Jeremy Scott's fingerprints were found in the car? And he says, well, I thought he was a thief. He's a punk and a thief. She says, your office prosecuted him twice for murder. And he's like, he just lost it. And there was just a lot of those moments where she was just holding him accountable to every single fact. So she said, couldn't Jeremy be both a car stereo thief and a murderer? And, he couldn't answer that all of a sudden. So I knew that he was going to be dead when she talked to him. But yeah, that was one of the best moments.
Three cheers for Kelsey.
Yeah.
Got a question for Gil.
By the way, I'm not a lawyer, but that's not an out. You can ask me.
All
tough
these
questions.
criminal justice students are
Yeah,
going to put you on the hot seat.
Don't hold
Gil.
anything back.
I would like to know, how did Jeremy come into contact with Michelle? Were they like acquaintances or anything like that?
Well, that is the basis of our 9th and final episode. I'll just tell you, he lived a mile away from where Michelle disappeared. And Jeremy Scott had killed 3 other people. And he's forensically linked to 3 of the 4 murders. He told us and confessed that he was, homeless. He was walking up the street in the rain, and he saw somebody on the phone making a phone call. And sure enough, Michelle made this last phone call to Leo at 9:45 p.m., where she said, I'll be right over. And Jeremy approached her at this gas station payphone, and she said, I know you. They lived in the same neighborhood. And he said, it's raining. I need a ride to my trailer. And she let him in the car and drove him. And she ended up driving past the place he wanted to go into this wooded area where he used to take his ex-girlfriends, by the way. And so that's where they ended up, in this spot. That's where they found the body. And later on, they found his fingerprints in the car. And the state tried to just say, oh, he was just an innocent car stereo thief. He had nothing to do with the murder. Even after he confessed, they said he's a liar. You can't believe a word he said, except when he says he didn't kill Michelle. Then you can believe him. It was pretty preposterous.
All right, there was a hand up over here. Okay. Yeah.
Is it possible for a retrial, considering he did have a confession and there's DNA evidence that he did it in the car, since his fingerprint would be nowhere else?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is they've had 2 attempts to bring the new evidence, the fingerprints, and ultimately Jeremy did confess. And they brought this before the courts, and the courts had ruled that Jeremy was not a credible witness and he can't be believed. And so Leo is out of legal options right now. The only thing he can do now is wait for possible parole or with clemency. And that would come from the governor. And that's your question before, which I forgot to answer. But basically, after I wrote Devil in the Grove, it came out, and there started to be some movement in Florida to like correct this injustice. And it got political. I started to see like Marco Rubio talking about it on the news, saying now's the time to address this injustice of the Groveland Four, which is, from the book that I'd written. And they were passing it around to legislators in Florida, state representatives, and they put together a bill, a claims bill for relief. And governor, he was Ron DeSantis running for governor. And he said, the first thing I do when I get into office, I'm going to address the Groveland Four. And sure enough, the second day in office, he called a clemency hearing and ended up pardoning the Groveland Four and reopening the case. And just last year, the Groveland Four were officially exonerated in court. That took 72 years, though, 72 years for justice. I kind of hold out some hope that the state of Florida is a little bit unlike some of these traditional, cotton belt civil rights states like Mississippi, Louisiana. People don't think of Florida as being the South sometimes, but I do kind of hold out hope. Like there's been a lot of injustices in Florida, but they're also willing to correct injustices from the past. And so that's the angle we're trying to go, that there's no political downside to freeing an innocent man from prison.
But you're bringing pressure. Tell about the petitions, tell about well-known people who are taking up the cause. And
Yeah, we have a petition out there on change.org. It's from the Innocence Project of Florida. And I think it has like 16,000 signatures at this point, and it's growing exponentially now. And there's a lot of pressure behind the scenes because we're not really making this a political issue because it's a very difficult political state right now. Governor DeSantis looked like he's going to run for president, and he's put out some responses that he's not going to be doing any clemency or any pardon. So some of this stuff has to happen quietly behind the scenes. But I can tell you that I've had some very powerful people in Florida reach out to us saying that this needs to be fixed. And I think the good people of Florida, as much as I like to beat them up and bash them about their wrongful convictions, I also do hold out a lot of hope that they want to do the right thing. And there, like I said, there is no political downside to freeing an innocent person from prison.
All right, I have one here and then another.
Sure.
Was the murder weapon ever found?
No, the murder weapon was never discovered. And the reason is they didn't find out about Jeremy Scott for 17 years after the murder. That's when they finally identified the fingerprints. And that was another thing that the police should have done. If you think about it, at this point, Jeremy Scott had been arrested for murder and he went to trial and he was acquitted. Trust me, he got away with that murder. They just didn't have enough evidence to prove it, but he later confessed to this murder as well. So now they have a known murderer who lived about a mile away from the victim, and the fingerprints are found in the car. It's a pretty compelling case, but they didn't find him for 17 years. And so that became a problem.
Is going back to John Aguero, in your opinion, is this a protection thing against John Aguero? Is there people behind the scenes that worked with him in the past that are protecting him even though he's passed on? Or is this like an egg on your face to the courts that they don't want to?
Yeah,
I
know what you're saying. I think it's worse than that. I think one of the problems that stemmed, like Jeremy Scott, after killing Michelle, he went on and killed another man about a year later. And this time he got convicted and sentenced to life in prison. And so his prosecutor was John Aguero. And so John Aguero prosecuted Leo Schofield in 89 and Jeremy in 90. And so the same person who's supposed to be investigating Jeremy Scott, if he does a real investigation, he'd have to overturn his own investigation and his own conviction of Leo Schofield. And what happens in those state prosecutors' offices, the ego becomes involved. A prosecutor's job is supposed to be to seek justice, not to win convictions at any cost. But sometimes when ego gets in the way and political ambitions, he was a young rising star. He didn't want like a wrongful conviction on his record. That's like a big asterisk. You might not become state attorney someday because of that. You might not be appointed a judge. And so he was the one that shut down the investigation into Jeremy Scott. And I think the reason that state attorneys' offices don't want to look into this is that they just don't want to admit they're wrong. I think there's also some like compensation issues. If you wrongfully convict someone, you're entitled to, in the state of Florida, it's $50,000 a year for each year wrongly incarcerated. So that for Leo, I think the total will be $1.5 million or something like that. It's a lot of money. He's been in jail for 35 years now. It's just part of their system that they just do not want to admit they're wrong. Overturning a conviction has become impossible, especially in these deep rural communities where they don't think they need a conviction integrity review unit. We asked them about that. Kelsey asked the state attorney why they don't have a conviction integrity review unit that can look at these dicey cases where they're, compelling evidence of innocence. And the state attorney basically said, we don't get it wrong. They maybe need them up in Tampa and Jacksonville and Orlando, but we get our convictions right. No, you don't. I looked at least half a dozen convictions that were overturned and exonerated by DNA evidence. You don't always get it right.
Give us that statistic you gave, and I know we got a question, Jen, but
Oh, yeah.
the number they have sent to their death and the number that were wrongly accused that they left. This is a stunning number.
Yeah, since the US Supreme Court made it possible, reinstated the death penalty in, I think it was 1976, the state of Florida has executed 99 people. In that same time period, 30 people on death row in Florida were exonerated because it was found from DNA evidence that they were wrongly convicted. So for every 3 people sentenced to death and executed in Florida, 1 person is fully exonerated. Think about that statistic. This is in a death penalty case, a capital case, where you have a much longer appeal process, much more scrutiny among lawyers. Just think about a regular first-degree murder that doesn't involve death. There's hundreds and hundreds of these in Florida, and you just have to wonder, Leo Schofield can't be the only innocent person. So the numbers are kind of staggering. And Florida may be worse than all the other states, but Texas, California, they're not far behind.
All right, question from up the top row.
At the beginning, you did say that you wanted to make a podcast about like the people that are like alive. I was just wondering, do you think by making a podcast about the case with the people that are still alive and showing evidence to the public that they would reopen the case?
That's what we were thinking, but unfortunately, all the legal avenues to reopen Leo's case are gone. There's no further legal path because he's taken his appeals and the appellate courts have rejected them. So the only possibility Leo has now is to be paroled or to be pardoned by the governor. The only other opportunity is if some new evidence emerges, but the man who was forensically linked to the crime scene confessed in detail to the crime. There's not going to be any more compelling evidence than that. You can't ask for more. Sometimes I think if this was reversed, if Jeremy Scott had confessed first, what would the state attorney say? The prosecutor would say, that's fine. You can confess to any murder you want. Are you forensically tied to the crime scene? And he is. So he's killed 4 people in this little community. And he's confessed to all 4 of them, and he's forensically linked to 3 of them. It's pretty obvious when you listen to our podcast. I think it's obvious that he's not lying. He's dealing with memory. He gets traumatized. At one point, we asked him if he ever thinks about Michelle, and he basically started crying. And he said, I go to sleep with the faces of dead bodies, the people I killed. And that he said, that's my punishment. It's torture. This is a man who is trying to do something positive in his life he doesn't know Leo. He doesn't even care about Leo. He's doing this for his own mental sanity. And I think the fact that, the state doesn't want to believe him is just barbaric.
I think we
You
got
want one
time for
more question?
one more question for the audience, Jen.
She raised her hand first, sorry.
Has there been any advocacy regarding Michelle's family on the behalf of Leo? If so, has it changed over the years? And if not, do you think it would have made a difference in the original prosecution?
It's a great question. Michelle's younger brother, Jesse, we ended up interviewing him. He agreed to talk to us. He believes that Leo's not guilty. He wrote a letter to the state of Florida and asked that it be read at Leo's last parole hearing. And in the last parole hearing, he said, I do not have any confidence in this conviction. I support Leo's parole. And the state attorney refused to read it in court. So there's just a lot of those kind of instances where they're just sweeping things under the rug. They want this case to go away because it's an embarrassment to them. And I think I think it was Governor Reuben Askew in Florida back in the 70s who came up with the Sunshine Law, who decided to make all records public to people like me who want them. And his quote was, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And I think that's what we're giving with this podcast. We've changed the narrative. We talked to all the people that the state didn't want to talk to. We've done the work that they didn't want to do for their own reasons to protect this conviction. And now, from my understanding, is that everyone in Lakeland, Florida is listening to this. And I was told at their Christmas parade that there was a bunch of people when the sheriff and the state attorney went by on a float, they were screaming out, "Free Leo, free Leo." So it's gaining momentum. And the Innocence Project has the case. I think it's only going to gain more and more momentum over the next coming months before Leo goes to that next parole hearing. You're welcome to come down to Florida and stand outside. We're going to have hundreds of people there. The media is going to be there. It's going to be an event.
And you can go on change.org to sign the petition. You can listen to the podcast. He's added a bonus track, but I do want one more reminder. We've got Bookhouse, Jack Huber selling copies of Gil's book. He'd be happy to sign them afterwards.
We'll be signing in the Great Hall just outside.
Yeah, the Great Hall
There's a table
outside.
out there.
But one final question, Gil. I
Yeah.
mean, the Pulitzer Prize, 6 million downloads, these nominations, but this is hard work, man. 4 years working, really paying yourself to keep it going at first. You don't know if you're going to really make any money off this. It's a different economic scale on podcast. What drives you and what's going to drive you next? Do you think a book next, or this podcast into a book, or another podcast?
All I can say is like, I'm involved with the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. And so over the years, I've met people who are getting these awards. I'm now the host of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. I've been there for 10 years in a row. And the people I meet are people like Brian Stevenson and some of these great writers who care about peace and social justice. And I think it's my involvement with these organizations that, makes me think I'm 60 years old. I don't have that many books left in me. And, they take me 5 years each time I do a story. This podcast took me 4 years. So I have to be really selective about the stories that I want to tell. But, this is the area I want to stay in. I really feel passionate about this. It's very hard to live with a story for 4 years if you don't really believe in it, or you're just trying to churn it out there and move on to the next product. I just want to make sure that every story I tell, because I don't know how many I have left, counts for something and means something and can maybe affect change. Maybe not just in one person's life, but maybe something in the criminal justice system is slightly different now because we've learned from the past. And so that's what really drives me.
He's a writer, he's a host, he's a producer, he's a great humanitarian. Our friend Gilbert King.